Hi, so my name is Oiza Baiye, and today I'm going to present on the subject of coding a tooltip within the context of a design system. So earlier this year, I had the opportunity at Bevy, which is a company I work at, to create a reusable tooltip for a component library. So this talk will show some of the approaches we took in creating that tooltip. So I'm just going to share my screen, 1 second. Okay, so making the tooltip. So in this talk, I will briefly cover the nature of tooltips in a design system, just so that the context is there. But the bulk of my presentation is going to focus on how we built the component, the tooltip component at Bevy. And we'll get to see some code, which I recreated in a code sandbox. So I'm not actually going to show Bevy's code. I just created a version of the tooltip in code sandbox, which I will show. And that's pretty much what we'll cover. So what's a design system? So I've seen a number of descriptions on the internet. These are just a few that I thought were very useful. I think the main takeaway is that a company can create its own design system. And typically that's a way to harmonize the building blocks for a front-end user interface. So a design system will often include a component library. And in the component library, there would be a standard design or code for things like buttons or tooltips or headings and that kind of thing. So what's a tooltip? It's like an info or a hint box. Typically, it appears when a user hovers over something in the UI. For example, in this example, they're hovering over the download button. So when a user hovers or taps, if it's on the phone or focuses using a keyboard tab, then the tooltip will appear. So there's a lot going on this slide, but this is the basic anatomy of the tooltip at Bevy. The main takeaway is that our tooltip has 3 parts. There's the tooltip itself, which is like the container. And within that, there's a message part. And then there's an arrow or pointer, which the designer or developer can decide on whether that should be included. And below, I just have a screenshot of how a developer would create an instance of the tooltip when building a page or a component. You basically pass the trigger element being the thing that the user hovers on, and you pass that as a child of the tooltip. So here are some of the requirements that we addressed when building the tooltip. Most of these, excluding the last one, were specified by our designers. There were actually a lot more than this, but I'm focusing on just a few of them to make this talk really brief. So first, the tooltip will accept a trigger element, which could be a button, it could be a div, it could be an image, whatever. The tooltip should not be messed up by styles of other things on the page. Number 3, it should show on hover or tap or focus. The next one is that it accepts a position, which could be top, bottom, right, or left. However, number 5, the tooltip will change position if there's no space in the selected direction. And then it will have an optional arrow that will point in the opposite direction to where the tooltip is located. And so if the tooltip is below the trigger element, so that is the tooltip position is bottom, then the arrow will be on top. If the tooltip is to the right, then the arrow is pointing to the left. And finally, our team just decided that we weren't going to use special libraries or plugins. We would just stick to basic React, CSS, and things like prop types and the class name util. So I'm going to focus on just 3 of the solutions to the requirements I showed earlier. First, to prevent the tooltip from conflicting with other elements on the page, we use create portal from React DOM. So React Portal is a way to append an element to the document outside of its parent's hierarchy. And this can be very useful if you're worrying about styles like overflow hidden or fixed positioning affecting the child because they're on the parent. Number two, for changing position based on space, we basically use the native get bounding character method to fetch dimensions for almost everything on the page and then calculate the optimal position for the tooltip. And finally, based on the optimal position for the tooltip, we can decide where the arrow or indicator should be located. So we're going to see some code, but first, just to give some background, I wanted to make it easier to follow on what's coming, to follow what's coming in the rest of the presentation. This is basically how my tooltip folder looked in the repo at the end. I'm mainly going to focus on the first two files, which is tooltip.js and portal.js. All right, so here is an implementation of Portal. As I mentioned, React Portal is useful in extracting an element outside the normal flow of its parent and rendering that element on the page. So I basically created this Portal component, which accepts the tooltip and then creates a new div in the document, returns the portal as part of the div. Line 17 is just something that we added to handle test failing in Circle CI. It might not be necessary for your environment, but it was for us. And this slide is how we would use the portal in the tooltip file. This is a very, very stripped down version of Tooltip.js. There's actually a lot more divs that were involved, which you actually see later. But in summary, we're rendering the tooltip within the portal, but the trigger is outside the portal. And all of these are just provided as part of the Tooltip API. All right, so let's talk about how we would calculate the best position for the tooltip in relation to the trigger. So first, you'll notice that the tooltip accepts props, including position and children. Children would be the trigger element. And we define the initial state, which is that the tooltip does exist in the DOM, but it's just way off screen and not visible. So it has like position top being like minus 10,000 pixels, for instance. And then on line 111, we have our state variables, which will be used to set the styles for the tooltip later on, as well as the function set tooltip position. Then we attach refs to the different elements of the API, like the message, the tooltip itself, and the trigger elements. We use the trigger ref in particular to add event listeners to the DOM for a few different events. So when, for example, the mouse enter event on line 154 occurs, this handle enter function above it is invoked. And within that handle enter function, we have a calculate position function call, which I will show, like, I think it's in the next slide. But in short, the tooltip position is set using the return from calculate position. And there has to be a use effect return function in the code, but I'm not going to show it because it doesn't fit in the screenshot. But basically, we would have a return in which we remove all these event listeners when the component unmounts. Okay, let's look at calculate position. So it accepts the refs that we defined, and it also accepts the developer chosen position as props. It then figures out the dimensions for the window, as well as, the message and tooltip and trigger, because all of that will determine where the tooltip will go in the end. So the way I look at this block is let's say the spec calls for the tooltip to be placed below the trigger element. So the tooltip position is bottom. If there is no vertical space below the trigger, then we'll place the tooltip on the top instead. So this if block does that for all the other directions. It flips the position to the opposite based on the window dimensions, the tooltip dimensions, and the message dimension, as well as the trigger dimensions. So it takes into account all those things. However, there's a problem. What if the opposite side doesn't have space either? So what if the window height is so small that it can only fit the trigger elements, but it can't fit the tooltip on either the top or the bottom? But the position calls for bottom, for instance. Well, in that case, we need another control flow to deal with that possibility. So imagine the lines 44 to 50 on this slide have been added above the code we just saw on the previous slide, which would like, the previous slide would be like from line 52 here. So this code is saying if the position is top, but there's no space on top or bottom, then put the tooltip on the right. The code basically determines whether we need to flip from horizontal to vertical or flip from vertical axis to horizontal. And then from there, we basically have our final position. And that would be represented by this tooltip position variable in line 72. So the rest of our calculate position function determines where the tooltip will be placed. Will determine, the final dimensions for the tooltip, which are then returned as state values along with the tooltip position. And if you remember, these return values are passed to set tooltip position. That was the setter function that we destructured in useState earlier. Then here's how we would use the tooltip position, that the arrow direction. Not going to focus too much on this, but we also create a variable flex directions, which we end up using as a class name in the tooltip render. And that corresponds to certain styles that we have in a tooltip.less file. And finally, here is what our TooltipJS would render. So you see in line 225, we use the state values to set position absolute in line, as well as the height or width of the tooltip. Then we have a whole bunch of class names and the rest of like all those divs that correspond to different styles we have in our CSS and less. And so I'm actually going to show my code sandbox, which I think requires, oh yeah, it's right here. All right. See if I make this a little bigger. All right. So I'll start with our app.js, which mimics how one would consume the Tooltip API in the wild, but actually in practice, we import each component from the Bevy design system package, which was published to, it's a private NPM package. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we're just importing the tooltip as a file. So the position is supposed to be on top, but of course there can't be space on the top. So when you hover, the tooltip goes on the bottom. So I'm going to try changing the position to left actually, because there's not space on the left either. So position left. And the tooltip shows on the right because there's no space on the right. And I'm going to just shorten the message because that was also a tricky problem we had to solve. Great. And on the bottom. And voila, that basically concludes my talk. Yeah, thank you for listening. Keanu says thank you on my behalf. And I hope you learned something about how to make a tooltip in a design system.